Hey guys, do you ever wonder what the future of food looks like? Well, I have the perfect guest for you on today's podcast. Mike Lee, the guy behind The Future Market and the author of Mise, is my guest. And he's also the host of a new podcast on our podcast network, The Tomorrow Today Show. And so we talk about that. We talk about how Mike became a futurist and where he sees things going. So if you are curious about the future of food, if you want to become a futurist yourself, or you just want to hear about Mike's backstory, it's super interesting. I encourage you to listen to this episode. Have at it. Enjoy.
This podcast is part of the Spoon Podcast Network, home of smart conversations that feed your mind.
All right. Two Mikes on a podcast. This episode, Mike Lee, I'm really excited about because, as you know, I'm a big fan of your work. Welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. As I was getting ready for this podcast, I was thinking back to when I first got to know you. I know you came out to Seattle for a Smart Kid to Summit early on.
That sounds about right.
And I think you're on a session talking about maybe the future of food personalization. And I remember for the next couple of years, I'd always reference one of the things you said, this idea of like a food identity card or something, or food passport. And it just, at that time, it got me thinking, well, Mike's an interesting thinker. And you've done nothing but prove that out in the intervening years, because I really like the way you think about food systems.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, at some point in my career, I just started doing the stuff that I love the most. And, even way back in the day when like my first like meaningful job out of college was I worked at American Express on the tech team. It has nothing to do with food, tangentially maybe, but, our job was to kind of look 3 to 5 years out. And, that was really fun. But then one of the things I did while I was doing that job is just an extracurricular. Like no one asked me to do this. Nobody required me to do this. I just started putting on these little innovation sessions. I'd rent out like an auditorium room, and me and a colleague, this guy named Colin McCabe, who still works in tech, we just like every, I don't know, whatever it was, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, would like put on this hour and just gather all of these like innovation signals and just put on these little mini presentations for people.
That is cool. I did not know you did that. So would you rent out like a local Lions club or a room at the American Express office?
No, just because we were in the American Express Tower downtown in Wall Street. So there's just hundreds of conference rooms you have access to as an employee. Like we would pick off like one of those it's like a classroom where they would do like a corporate training or something like that.
And was the idea, I mean, you love talking about these signals, but did it have a purpose of, hey, I dig futurist work, or I want to kind of gather cool people in a room that can help me shape my career? Was there kind of a bigger purpose, or?
It was pure curiosity. Like I mean, all of those things, did it did kind of bring attention to me and Colin as like the guys that like to look at innovation stuff. Like our official job was to do like little pilots, tech pilots and stuff like that. Our team actually created an early prototype of an app. This is in 2007 or 8. Just to give you context, right? So it was this little app that we created with the newly launched, iPhone, which was this thing called like Car Concierge, and you'd push a button on a screen. We'd use the GPS to find out where you were, and that a human being would call a black car service and send you a car and then charge it to your credit card.
That's pretty cool.
And we did that pilot for like 3 months, right? And then, it was too early. They shelved it, obviously. Yeah. And then obviously 6-7 years ago, I see Uber and I was like, that looks familiar. And I'm like, oh my God, my God. Yeah, I think it's also indicative of that time. Thousands. Like right now, we've got all this stuff around AI and stuff like that. And I'm excited about all that stuff. And I haven't felt that way since the early 2000s when I had that entry-level job. Yeah. When social media was coming into its existence and smartphones were coming into its existence.
It was kind of new. The mobility revolution, the social media revolution.
Yeah.
It's so new. It's so interesting how like those first jobs or two out of college may shape the entire direction of the way your career goes. And that futures what you're doing there, I think really did shape it. When I got out of grad school, I went to grad school pretty quickly after undergrad, and I got a job working under the office of the CEO at a semiconductor distributor. And it's a Fortune 500 company. It was publicly traded. And so we were doing competitive intelligence and also like helping him, Roy Valley, prepare for Wall Street. Mm-hmm. But it was marketscaping and kind of analyzing the landscape. And that's something I've been doing ever since. And it seems like you really took what you did those early days and shaped the entire direction of your career.
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, I was doing that kind of stuff during the day, but then at night I had a supper club So like the beauty of working at a company like American Express early on in your career is like the work-life balance is insanely good. Like I
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
I stayed late until 6 p.m. in the office one day. I was like the only one on the whole floor. And
Oh my God.
the floor holds like 300 people. So
So the supper club idea, I love. Why did you think of doing a supper club? Were you always a food guy? Did you just love the idea of getting friends together? And what was the original idea there?
yeah, it was my family. I grew up in a big family with big restaurant family, multiple restaurants in the family. And like even like a casual Sunday dinner could balloon to like 15 people on just a random Sunday, right? And so I always grew up around this kind of convivial like friends and then I took that and threw it into college. I love getting people together and just gathering. And then once I moved to New York, I was kind of a lot of my college friends moved to like Chicago. And so I was kind of like rebuilding my like friend group as like a early 20s person in New York City. And I started cooking for a couple friends. I was like, this is really cool. Like we used to have this tradition. We'd go to Central Park and just hang out all day. And then we'd go to the Whole Foods at Columbus Circle. I'd buy like a 9-pound slab of tuna from the seafood counter, like a solid block. And then we'd all go to my house and we'd just have like a sushi making party.
You'd have to take a mortgage out in your house now to buy that 9-pound slab of tuna, probably.
I know. But yeah, we'd all just ship it, and then we were like, okay, this is fun. And then people started bringing because you're hanging out at the park all day, and like friends will show up, and then you kind of snowball this group. And I was like, this is kind of cool because like we went beyond our first circle of friends. Now there's a second circle that are now friends, and then I just started like I remember one frantic weekend. I stayed in Friday, Saturday, Sunday, which is like a young 20-year-old person in New York City is like unheard of, right? Unless you're like sick.
Yeah.
And I just like came up with this idea to studio feast. Other people were doing supper clubs by then. That was kind of like the first rise of like the pop-up dining club in New York, at least in those early 2000s. And I just thought it was so cool. And I thought it was a more interesting way to do restaurant-like things without opening a restaurant. Because I know opening a restaurant is so hard and it consumes you. And you have to be so concerned about the business of it. And I didn't really want to deal with that because I already had a day job that like fulfilled all the needs that I had financially. And so this was really more of a thing to just be like a social thing, but also just an outlet for creativity with cooking and, a pop-up model. I was like, it doesn't have to generate a single dollar of profit. In fact, if I break even, that is complete winning. Like this is, yeah.
If you had done it 10 years later, you think you would have gone all fly fish on the idea? So like done like a blockchain version?
I think you would have needed more than 10 years because this is 2007.
Yeah. Which, by the way, we will talk about the podcast later, but on your first one around restaurants, you talked with the Fly Fish group, and I was on that. So that was a lot of fun. So I didn't know that you had that background. I think you mentioned it a little bit, but that's a great backstory to where you eventually went. I remember also really enjoying some of the work you did around Future Market and reimagining the grocery shopping experience. And so one of the other kind of key things I remember you doing early on was when I went to the Fancy Food Show, you had done this entire activation for them, building out a grocery store of the future. And I thought, oh, this is such a cool idea. Like me as an old analyst, I would just put something on a PowerPoint. You actually created this vision in 3D, very experiential. So that was something that I thought was really cool. How did you get to that point where you wanted to actually build things that told us where we're going into the future?
So that was indirectly influenced by like my early corporate days. Because the other thing that I did after undergrad, I went to undergrad Michigan business, and then I did graphic design at Parsons after that. So part of what I did a lot of at Amex was just like make decks for people, like my bosses, right? And just boring decks of like blah, blah, blah is up 12% this week, yada, yada, yada. And I think this even started as early as college. Like I was always trying to find a way to kind of make the deck do a little bit more than anybody else was doing. And sometimes that was just like, I don't know, put a meme in there or something like that, right? Little things just to spice things up a little bit. I'm really into graphic design. So even though I was doing PowerPoints, like none of them were going to win design awards, but like I always really just made sure to construct my slides really clean and nice. I almost see PowerPoint decks as like a DJ set or a story that like the slides that you put in are akin to records that you're going to play, right?
Yeah.
And which, by the way, I had that background as well too. I was a DJ in college. And so like everyone loves to rail on PowerPoint. PowerPoint's the end of blah, 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 this. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think that the content is what is boring or not boring, not PowerPoint.
Yeah, I
Like
agree.
like if you're a good designer and you're a good storyteller, it doesn't matter what tool you're using to tell the story.
You're probably using PowerPoint to tell that TED talk, but
Sure.
we've all seen amazing TED talks. It's the storyteller and the way they structure the story.
Yeah. So that's sort of like the setup for how I got to the future market, because I was basically attuned to, especially in corporate environments, how do I get my message to stand out a little bit better than anyone else's message? Because that's also where I learned innovation. That's why I work with corporates right now, because like my experience is in like innovation in a corporate setting, right? Where it's a very different thing than startup thing, where you have no background or legacy or anything you're attached to. It's just new what you're making, and you can just invent the future. And that's really cool. With like corporate kind of innovation, you have to contend with the giant machine that already exists. So you kind of have to find ways to like communicate the future in ways that completely don't alienate or freak people out, in a sense, right? I took that insight when I started working exclusively in food after Chobani, and then just going out on my own, of saying like, what would be the best way to show people the future of food that wasn't just like a trends deck? Because everybody was doing trends deck. It's like, what if we started like mocking up the future products that we wanted to see, like use the vernacular of CPG to show something that was completely outerworldly, like, an entire Christmas ham that was generated through cell ag or something like that, but like package it in a package that looked like something slightly familiar, So that's kind of the genesis of where Future Market started. And then, the people at Fancy Food, they graciously, let us, we did, I think, 4 shows with them, and building these little exhibits that would showcase these kind of concept products. Those concept products are completely concept CPG products. Those are completely inspired by concept cars, which I talk about a lot.
Yeah. And I know that you're in Detroit now. You have a strong connection to Detroit, and we talked a little bit about that, I think, before. And this idea of the concept car, it was something that was being done in the auto industry, but no one was really just building crazy concepts for the future in other industries. I love that you borrowed from that to do it for food.
Yeah, that was really it. I mean, I remember being sent to my first Expo West when I was working at Chobani, and just kind of like, this is the future food, I mean, there was like progressive stuff there. There's interesting stuff there for sure, but it didn't have there wasn't any section that had the same kind of verve as like the thing about concept cars that I saw, which I always thought growing up was like a very Disney World like experience. Like, you're basically going to this trade show, but somebody built this like kind of world where this strange car exists. I always thought that was so cool. So yeah, I was trying to like figure out, how do I do that for food? And I'm still figuring that out. I'm still working on that.
And it gets interesting and more interesting every year as the world progresses from a technology innovation standpoint. You have more tools to do it with.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you're leveraging some of those tools now. For Mise, one of the things that I've loved about your book, we could talk about that a little bit, is this idea of creating what these might look like using AI. You're writing the entire story yourself, but you're using AI to create visualizations, which I found really impactful. And you did it in a sense like you created almost a magazine-like feel for it. So I like that you're leveraging these new tools, but just stepping back, what I really liked about your recent work over the last couple of years is the fact you're using storytelling, narrative storytelling, creating fiction to illustrate what the future looks like. And that was a really interesting and new approach that I had seen. You referenced before who you took influence from, but I really liked the way you were doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a simple observation of why to kind of do more of that. I remember at some conference I was at, you do the conference during the day and you talk about the content there, and then everybody goes to the happy hour, right? And then they talk a little bit more shop. And then inevitably I found somehow like the conversation always came down to like, let's talk about last night's Game of Thrones episode or last night's Sopranos episode or whatever the big show was at the time. And this was sort of the rise of like prestige television. And it just kind of remarked to me that like all the people that I saw at the bar were so much more excited to talk about the last episode of The Sopranos or Game of Thrones than they were the content in some form, right? And I just observed that, and I just like wondered like, wow, this person lit up when we started talking about Game of Thrones last night. And I just realized that like I think we're missing out on an opportunity in kind of companies and industries to not leverage the kind of storytelling that people naturally want to talk about all the time. And HBO's Silicon Valley really inspired me too, because that basically took a really just big industry and turned it into entertainment. But
Yeah.
it was also like, I know some people that work in Silicon Valley that they can't watch it because they're like, it's too real.
Yeah. Well, as the creator of the Smart Kitchen Summit, when I saw the smart fridge hot dog, not hot dog, I go, oh, that's hitting pretty close to home, right?
I mean, I think that's maybe the modern day signal that you've arrived, is that you get lampooned by something, right?
Yeah. Do you remember in the beginning of the show when they rolled the credits, they had that little cartoon flyover of Silicon Valley?
Yeah.
And I remember the year after the Juicero story broke,
Yeah.
they had a little Juicero right there next to like
Yeah.
HP. I thought it was so funny.
I mean, so like I love that stuff, and I think Mise, the magazine, is sort of like my response. It was very much inspired by Silicon Valley and HBO. How do I tell stories that are fictional, yes, but rooted in the real truth of how the industry works and what's happening in the industry? That's really a big inspiration for Mise. And if I did that, could I get people to talk about industry issues that are sometimes kind of dry? Could I get people in the industry to talk about those issues at cocktail parties in a way that was more animated, in a way that was more made them feel more excited, like it was talking about Game of Thrones, not just work, you know? So
And I think you've done that. And I think it was at Google Food Lab when I first saw one of your presentations around that. And so not only do you have this really rich source material and like this great, by the way, I love physical media. I used to love getting magazines as a kid. And so it's such a treat to get a piece of physical media nowadays that is so well done because there's not that much left anymore, right? And so you put a lot of love into the creation of essentially what feels like a really great high gloss magazine in Mise. And then I saw you present it. So you have this rich source material you present it. And so it's just like you've created essentially what I think is a road show. You have this media, and then you could just go. And I imagine you're getting a lot of calls from food brands saying, hey, come and talk and tell the story and how all these new innovations are going to impact our future here at Company X.
Yep. And so it was almost like a year ago that I gave that first presentation at Google Food Lab. It was almost a year ago when Mise Volume 1 launched. I think it was like April 27th or something like that. And the kind of true business model of Mise is working with food clients to create custom versions for them, right? You know, and I've done that since then. You know, I've worked with a large food service client. I've worked with a huge flavors company. And it's basically like taking the style and approach of Mise and just adapting it and focusing it to just the issues that matter for the client, right? So that's a big message in Mise, is like, you know, these topics that I'm writing, these are all independently written and researched by me based off of what I think is interesting, but I can totally like turn around and do like a mini Mise or a full Mise for a company client that's worried about whatever. Yeah, mini Mise that just focuses and brings to life the stuff that worries them or gets them excited.
What does that look like in the boardroom? I mean, I've done some consulting. I come from a little bit from that background. I mean, I can imagine like high-end McKinsey's going into some of these big food brands as they're trying to figure out the future, restructure, maybe some of the maybe more specialist consultancies. I imagine this brand of future work in the boardroom maybe creates some really interesting reactions. Are they embracing it? Can you talk at a high level, not to name names, how people are reacting to this?
They react really well to it because it doesn't feel like a McKinsey presentation, even though I might include a lot of content that McKinsey might talk about. I kind of couch it as like, all right, I'm here for story time, right? And then, but the story is about you guys and the future of your company, right? I would argue that corporate America underplays storytelling quite a bit, but they don't realize that it's actually there, right? Like CEOs build culture. They build culture through the stories that they tell. And I'm not using story in a pejorative way of like I'm just making stuff up, right? But you know, the way a CEO gets in front of their employees and communicates what the market environment is like is a story. Even if they're showing a lot of numbers saying like revenue's down 12%, you can't just say revenue's down 12%. You have to give some sort of commentary on why that's happening. And you have to do it in a way that rallies your troops to say, okay, how do we change revenue down from 10%, right? So I think whether, you know, effective kind of corporate leaders think it or not, they're actually storytellers. They just don't do it in the same way that like a Peter Jackson does, but stories are the whole thing that hold an entire company up, right? Without the story, it's over, right? And so um, I tell a story, yes, but I do it in a way that looks a little bit more like they're maybe watching a television show than listening to a McKinsey presentation. And for me, I think I can get my message across a little bit easier because it's a little bit of spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down a little bit, you know?
I love that. Yeah.
I could totally do a very PowerPoint like consultant style deck that represents all of the research in Mise, but that wouldn't be very fun. And there's already a lot of people that do that.
There's a lot of people doing that. I know that you have a background. You actually did improv. Does that kind of that experience doing that in kind of a improvisational theater influence how you like to tell stories for your futurist work?
100%. Yeah. It taught me a lot about story structure. Like I still watch a lot of stand-up comedy. I think stand-up comedy and improv have a lot to teach kind of people that work in corporate settings and things like that. The best stand-up comedians, they stress every single word and make sure the setup is clear, and then they have some premise, and then you escalate the premise, and then you kind of give resolve with a punchline, right? You can look at that structure and do a quarterly earnings call that way if you wanted to, you know? But people just don't really think that way. They think that earnings calls have to be a certain way, right?
I guarantee you're going to get some CEO who wants to spice up his quarterly calls from a big food brand and say, Mike, help me do the stand-up version or something. Going to come to you now.
Yeah. Well, I think early on in my career, I got really good at like pattern recognition. And that's why like I when I think about like how would I get a CEO to learn from stand-up or improv, my goal is to not make them funnier necessarily. My goal is to just use the structure of good stories from those like genres and then get the CEO to apply that to their content. Ironically, one of the biggest things they teach you in improv is don't try to be funny. That's a paradox, but it's a completely different animal than stand-up. I think they're kind of like cats and dogs in that. Like the vibe of stand-up people and improv people are so different. Improv people are very much about like, you ever hang around with your friends and something dumb happens and everyone just starts laughing?
Yeah, yeah.
But it was like an accident and nobody, and then you try to retell that to somebody else later and they're like, I don't get it because you had to be there. Improv is very much like that, creating the conditions to create that little odd thing that happens in the group and then identifying it and exploiting it for like comedic effect, right? The worst improv is when somebody comes up and is all hacky and is like, I just, my arms are tired. I just flew in here. Yeah, blah, blah. That's like the worst improv ever. You're supposed to just exist in the moment and look for the odd things that come up and then double down on them. So yeah, I think
also it just trains you to think fast, I would imagine, and kind of think quickly. By the way, I don't know if you're a Mike Birbiglia fan, but I feel like he's lived in both worlds. Like I feel like he's doing the best stuff out there right now in terms of his sets. His hours are amazing.
I like his, because they're like storytelling heavy stand-up. He's not the typical kind of stand-up where he's
not at all.
Like, let's talk about airplane food. It's like some really deep life story. So like, yeah, I just think there's like cross-pollination is good for everything. Like, a big thing we talk about in food in the industry is like biodiversity being important for crops, right? And I think that in boardrooms and offices, like biodiversity of ideas and of genres is really important too. And that's really, I didn't really invent anything new. I just took stuff that existed in other genres and plopped it into food, So yeah.
Well, to give people a flavor of what you're working on, I really liked what you did with the first book around this family who is basically 20, 30 years in the future, and everyone has this embedded food sensor in their tummy, and they're basically trying to gauge. It's like kind of the tile for food, or like it's like the next big Apple product, but it's an embedded food sensor. You're also now looking towards other areas of the food system and coming up with stories like I think around restaurants. Can you talk a little bit about give us a peek at what you're working on?
Mm-hmm. So Mise Volume 2 is coming out soon, and it's all about the future of restaurants. Mise 1 was kind of a general kind of look at the future of food, touching on all kind of different aspects of it. Mise 2 is just going to double down on restaurants and food service alone. I have a lot of heart for that industry, just growing up in a restaurant family and doing like supper club stuff, but also just being a mega fan of restaurants in general. And I think there's just that's one of the subsections of food that just is facing so many different catalysts for change, for better and worse, right? And so it just felt like a really good time to kind of look at that as a topic.
And it does seem like it's an industry where the pace of change really got kicked in and it started the pedal to the metal like during the pandemic, and it hasn't slowed down at all. And so
Yeah, I think the pandemic really opened up, like ripped off a lot of band-aids. And it was a really big stress test for the industry. Not always good, obviously, mostly not good. But if you can take a silver lining out of it, it was such a traumatic moment for the restaurant industry that it really kind of brought to the surface a lot of things that I think the industry has to face going forward, whether or not there's another pandemic in the near future or not. So yeah, I love restaurants. I'm hopeful for them. And I want to try to kind of extend that conversation to get people to think critically about the stuff we're doing today with automation and AI and yada, 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 and see how that might pan out in the future for that industry.
And well, it's also a great segue to your podcast, because the first episode I participated on, and we talked about the future of restaurants, and I was really excited to be a part of that, and just more generally excited about bringing you into the world of podcasts. Because, like I said, I've been a fan of your work. I think you're a super thoughtful guy, and I just think it is going to be a tool for you to help you work through a lot of the things you're doing, but also get a lot of the stuff you're building and thinking about out into the world as new distribution channels. So I think it's going to be a great platform for you, essentially. So tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honored when you approached me about it, right? And I think you were definitely the straw that broke the camel's back, because like a podcast was always in the back of my mind. I just had never done one before, didn't really know much about it aside from just being a listener, and kind of launching it with you guys on a network seemed like a really good fit for me, because you guys just have like an infrastructure to help support it, right? And so that kind of like really sweetened the deal for me to like say, okay, I think now's the time. They're going to be launching this thing. There's other great people on this network too, and so let's do the podcast. But I love it. I mean, I don't know when this interview is going to air, but the first episode of the Tomorrow Today show should be out, about the future of restaurants, featuring you as co-host. We have Kristen Hawley from Expedite on there, Elizabeth Tilton from Oyster Sunday on there, and David Rodelitz from Fly Fish Club on there as our guests. And it's a 3-ish hour conversation.
Yeah. By the way, can you just talk about the length? Because I appreciate it, and I think there's an appetite for that. Like Joe Rogan can do that. A lot of people, though, like will just do I do shorter ones. I do 30 minutes just because it fits my schedule or whatever. Did you feel like you needed a bigger container in each episode to explore all the different things you wanted to work through?
Yes, I've always been a fan of long form podcasts. I'm a big fan of Lex Friedman does 3 to 5 hour podcasts. Sometimes I think he did a 6-hour podcast once.
That's crazy.
And I think like long form podcasts are a little bit of an antidote to kind of the clickbaity nature of the internet, the short attention span, because you're afforded the time to explore nuanced ideas in a kind of thoughtful way. You don't have to compress everything into a soundbite, right? And you can have it both ways as well too, because I think we're going to launch the long form podcast, but then also chop up
there's chapters within the bigger container.
Yeah, there's structure to it. So it's not just like a unstructured 3 hours of just, blathering. It's got chapters and it's got organization. So you can have it both ways. You can chop up smaller clips and do like a 2-minute clip that's like a highlight for people that only have 2 minutes or don't want to sit there for 3 hours. But then you also have the 3-hour thing. So say that 2-minute clip entices someone to learn more about it. And then you can kind of like sit there at the table with us and unpack a complicated idea without having just like talking points, right? One of the things that I love so much, there's this Spanish word, sobremesa, which it basically just means like the time after you're all out to dinner and dinner's done, dessert's done, maybe the check has been paid, and you're just sitting there and you don't want to leave. Or maybe it's happening at home, and just the conversation's so good, and you order another bottle of wine and you order more appetizers, and then more people show up and you just sit there for hours and hours and just chatting. I grew up that way with my family. I love that with my friends. I love having a 5-hour dinner where you're just sitting there and you kind of forget about time. So the podcast, in a way, we're not having dinner with people. It's not the same vibe, but it's just kind of like We
maybe
might.
eventually
Maybe
we'll
we
take it on
might.
the we'll take.
Yeah, so like that was one of the most meaningful things I've had. Some of the most meaningful conversations I've had with groups of friends or, colleagues or something is like those long table chats after dinner. And I just kind of wanted to bring a little bit of that sensibility into the podcast. So, that's the big inspiration for me insisting on a long form. Am I the only one in the network doing a long one like that?
I mean, Eric Schulze does an hour. I'll do hours. I just, quite honestly, you have more podcast stamina than me. No, I love the idea of really unpacking a topic. So I love what you're doing. I think it's an awesome way to do it. So, but no, I think most people are doing shorter ones than you.
Yeah.
So once you listen to this, go and look for Mike Lee's Tomorrow Today Show. And by the way, great name. What was the inspiration for the name?
I kind of wanted to make it feel like something that was like much more established than it actually was. Like that's it. I like simple names, honestly, too.
It's catchy. It's catchy too.
I like simple names because I think like with any name, like the content of what you do defines the name, not the name itself. Like
Yeah.
like KFC doesn't stand for Kentucky Fried Chicken anymore. It's just 3 letters. Same way, like, I mean, and so I don't think that it matters what it's called. People by now know what KFC is about. They serve fried chicken. And it's fast food fried chicken, right? You could name it Acme Fried Chicken or something like that. And I don't think most people would care. It's the same thing, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. I just like simple, catchy names. Like I look at some of the institutions of shows and things like that have been out there, like the Today Show, the Tonight Show, the Late Show, even John Oliver's Last Week Tonight. I kind of like, Saturday Night Live. Like in some respects, those are really boring names. Like they're just literally, oh, it's a show. When's it on? Today.
Yeah.
Cool. And so
yeah,
I don't know. I think also just the subject matter of it, it's about the future, but it's not just about the future in a fantasy sense. It's about how the future is being made today. And so it's maybe a little bit of a ripoff from the John Oliver Last Week Tonight show, because he's very literally we're talking about last week's news tonight. And I kind of went the other direction. I'm saying we're talking about tomorrow, but today. So that's the inspiration for it. Pretty simple.
And people can find it on the various podcast platforms. And this has been a lot of fun, Mike. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.